The silence wasn't just quiet. It was alive. It pressed against the walls of that dining room like something breathing, like the house itself had stopped its heart to listen. One moment, the Verdetta manor hummed with the low murmur of immortal men who had outlasted empires. The next, nothing. Because the maid, the one nobody looked at twice, the one whose hands never shook and whose eyes never stayed anywhere long enough to be remembered, had opened her mouth. And what came out was not an apology. It was not a stammer. It was ancient, sacred. A language that has no business living in a human throat. And just like that, the girl who had spent 4 years making herself disappear was seen. I want to tell you something true before I tell you the rest of it. Disappearing is a skill. People think it's something that happens to you, that the world just stops noticing, that you become invisible the way furniture becomes invisible, through sheer familiarity. But that's not how it works. Real disappearing is work. It is daily, deliberate, exhausting labor. It is the practiced art of making your footsteps soft, your gaze forgettable, your presence so unremarkable that the air doesn't shift when you enter a room. I had been doing it for 4 years, and I was very, very good at it. My name, inside the Verdetta estate, was Anya Watson. I wore it the way you wear a coat that doesn't quite fit, always aware of the weight of it, the way the shoulders sat wrong, the way it would never truly be mine. I was 38 years old. I knew how to set a formal table for 14. I knew which of the estate's long corridors creaked under weight and which could be walked in silence. I knew that Lord Torelli Verdetta took his evening meal at precisely 8, that he refused any fruit that had been touched by metal utensils, and that on the nights he didn't sleep, which was most nights, you could hear him pacing the east wing in the hours before dawn, his cane striking the marble in a rhythm that sounded, if you let yourself hear it, like a man counting the centuries. I was not supposed to let myself hear it. That was the first rule of surviving in a house like this. Do not humanize what lives inside it. The Verdetta estate sat at the edge of Baton Rouge, like something the bayou had exhaled and not quite reclaimed, a sprawling stone manor behind iron gates, surrounded by live oaks draped in Spanish moss, so heavy it blocked the afternoon light. In late October, when the heat finally began to break and the mist rose off the water before sunrise, the grounds had a particular quality of stillness that felt less like quiet and more like waiting. Like the land itself remembered what had been built on it and had never decided how it felt about that. I had come here through a sequence of careful, desperate choices I don't intend to explain tonight. What matters is that I came here hollow, and I stayed hollow by design. The other staff, Petra, the head housekeeper, who moved through rooms like a woman who had been trained never to feel surprise, Ondine, who managed the kitchens and spoke to no one about anything that mattered, Farrell, the groundskeeper, who had the eyes of someone who had buried things he'd been told to forget. They were kind enough, in the way that people who share a carefully maintained silence are kind. We did not ask each other questions. That was the second rule. The third rule, the one I had written for myself and kept closest, was simpler. Do not speak unless spoken to, and even then, say less than you know. I had been breaking that rule, slowly, for months. Not in the ways anyone could see. Just in the small internal ways. The moments when Lord Torelli said something historically incorrect at the dinner table, and I felt the correction rise in my throat like something living. The moments when I heard the covenant tongue beneath his rage, when the old words surfaced in his ranting the way old roots surface through pavement, and something in me responded before I could stop it. Something older than the name I was wearing. Something that recognized its own language. Tonight was a formal dinner. The Verdetta inner circle, 5 men who moved through the manor like weather systems, like something you prepared for rather than greeted. I had laid the table myself. Crystal. Black candles and silver. A bowl of fruit, figs, pomegranates, dark grapes, that I had selected because Lord Torelli, on his better days, would reach for a fig the way other men reached for something they loved and had almost given up on. I had learned his small hungers. I had learned all of their small hungers. That was what invisibility required, total attention to everyone else, no attention remaining for yourself. Lord Torelli was already in a fury before I lit the third candle. I could hear it in the cadence of his cane from the hallway. 3 hard strikes, then a pause. 3 more. He was not walking, he was punctuating. Something had displeased him, and that displeasure was radiating outward through the stone walls like heat. I set down the candlelighter, smoothed my apron, looked once at the room, the long table, the low light, the oil portraits of severe men in old clothes staring down from the walls, and I made myself small again. Shoulders dropped, eyes to the middle distance, hands folded at my waist. But under my left sleeve, against my wrist, something pressed. Copper and elder iron, warm from my skin. My mother's bracelet. The one thing I had not been able to bury. The doors opened. Lord Torelli entered, and the room changed the way rooms change when something ancient and unwell moves through them. A drop in temperature, a shift in how the light falls. Behind him, unhurried, came his son. Virgil Verdetta had been watching me for weeks. I had felt it the way you feel weather, not seeing the clouds but knowing in the body that something was coming. He said nothing to me tonight. He took his seat at his father's right hand, and he looked at me once, briefly, with eyes that held the particular quality of patience that only centuries can produce. I looked away first. I always looked away first. That was the last night I would. I have made a study of silence my entire adult life. I know the difference between the silence of an empty room and the silence of a room holding its breath. I know the silence that follows grief, the silence that precedes violence, the particular quality of silence that falls when something has just shifted in a way that cannot be undone. What fell over that dining room the moment the words left my mouth? I had never heard anything like it. Not in 38 years of living. Not in 4 years of hiding. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how it started. Lord Torelli's rage that evening had a specific texture. It was not the hot, combustible fury of a young man. It was the cold, dense anger of something ancient that has been disappointed one time too many, compressed over centuries into something that no longer needed to raise its voice to fill a room. He sat at the head of his table, and he seethed. Quietly, thoroughly. The way old stone seethes when it has absorbed too much heat and has nowhere left to put it. The dinner had gone wrong from the first course. The wine was wrong. The temperature of the room was wrong. Farrell had placed the fruit bowl 2 inches from where Torelli preferred it, and I watched the old lord's jaw tighten when he noticed, watched him say nothing, and understood that the nothing was worse than anything he could have said aloud. I moved through the room the way I always moved, carefully, economically, taking up as little space as possible. I refilled a glass. I straightened a candlestick. I kept my breathing even and my eyes where they belonged, which was on the tasks in front of me and nowhere else. And then Torelli spoke. Not to the table. Not to his son. Not to anyone in the room in any language a human ear was meant to catch. He turned his face slightly toward the window, toward the dark Louisiana night pressing against the glass, and he said something low and vicious and ancient. The covenant tongue. Sacred Aramaic. The language of the original accord between the Praxii and Verdetta bloodlines, spoken in the time before written history, before either family had names that humans could pronounce. The language of elders who remembered when the world was younger and uglier and made no apologies for either. He said, "You surround me with servants who cannot even hear me. I am alone in my own house. I have always been alone in my own house." My hands went still on the candelabra. It wasn't the words. I had heard cruelty before, crueler things from crueler mouths. It was the grief underneath them. The grief that Torelli would have died before admitting to in any language a living soul could understand. He had said it in the covenant tongue precisely because he believed no one in that room could hear him. It was the confession of a man who had run out of places to be honest. And something in me, something I had spent 4 years pressing down, walling off, starving of air, rose up anyway. I knew what it cost. I knew, even in the 3 seconds before I opened my mouth, exactly what I was about to lose. The name, the invisibility, the 4 years of careful, grinding survival. I knew all of it, the way you know the price of something before you reach for it and reach for it anyway, because you are so tired of keeping your hands at your sides. I said, in the covenant tongue, fluent, flawless, with the accent of the old interior, the accent of my mother's household, of lullabies I was never supposed to remember. You are not alone, my lord. You are heard. You have always been heard. The grief of a man who outlived everyone he loved is not nothing. It is the heaviest thing there is. Then, eat the figure. Your hands are cold. 3 sentences. Old. Quiet. Devastating. The silence that followed was not like any silence I have described to you before. This one had weight. It had texture. It pressed against my eardrums and the back of my throat, and it lasted long enough that I had time to watch, in my peripheral vision, every man at that table become completely, unnaturally still. I did not look at Virgil. I didn't need to. I could feel his attention shift the way you feel a change in air pressure, sudden, total, and impossible to ignore. He had been watching me for weeks with the patience of a man who suspected something but could not yet name it. In the space of 3 sentences, I had named it for him. Lord Torelli stared at me. His cloudy eyes, which usually moved over the staff the way eyes move over wallpaper, were sharp, focused. Something was moving through them. Shock, yes, but underneath the shock, something rawer. Something that looked terrifyingly like recognition. He did not speak. I set the candelabra down. Slowly. Carefully. With both hands, the way you set down something you know you will not pick up again. And then I walked out. Not quickly. Not desperately. With the same measured, unhurried pace I had practiced for 4 years, because running would have told them everything, and walking told them something far more dangerous. That I was not afraid of what I had just done. I was. God, I was. But fear and composure are not opposites. I learned that a long time ago in a life I was not supposed to remember. The corridor outside the dining room was cold and dim and smelled of old wood and bayou water. I made it 12 steps before I had to stop, press my back against the wall, and close my eyes. 12 steps. For years. And now, nothing would ever be the same again. I had known that before the words left my mouth. I had said them anyway. Because some things buried in you do not stay buried. Because the truth, eventually, gets tired of wearing your face. Because I was tired. Tired of being no one in a house full of everyone. Tired of hearing a lonely old man confess his grief into the dark and pretending I could not understand him. Some part of me had been waiting for that moment since the night I arrived. I just hadn't known it. I know it now. He found me by the magnolia tree at the far edge of the garden. I had not gone there to hide. Hiding implies you believe there is somewhere safe to go, and I had stopped believing that the moment I walked out of that dining room. I had gone there because the garden was the only place on the estate where the air felt honest, bayou mist rising off the water, the smell of wet earth and night-blooming jasmine, the live oaks standing in their patient, ancient way as though they had seen everything and decided long ago that none of it was worth rushing over. I heard him before I saw him. Not his footsteps. Virgil Verdetta did not make footsteps in the conventional sense. What I heard was the quality of the air changing. The garden going slightly quieter, the way small things go quiet when something larger enters a space. Then he was simply there, standing a few feet away with his hands in his pockets, looking at me the way you look at something you have been trying to solve for a very long time and have just, finally, found the missing piece of. I did not turn to face him immediately. I gave myself 3 more seconds with the dark water and the mist. 3 seconds of the last ordinary moment I would have for a very long time. Then I turned. You're not going to run, he said. It was not a question.
No, I said.
He studied me. There was no pretense in it, no performance of casualness. He simply looked at me the way men who have lived for centuries look at things that interest them, with full attention, without hurry, with a particular quality of patience that is almost its own kind of intimacy. It made my skin feel thin. The language, he said. Where did you learn it? And here is where I made my first deliberate choice of the night. Not the choice in the dining room. That had not been deliberate. That had been my blood overriding my better judgment. But this one I made with full awareness. I looked at Virgil Verdetta, and I chose how much truth to give him, and I chose carefully. My grandmother, I said. She was very old. She believed certain things needed to be preserved. She taught me the way you teach a child something you're not sure they'll understand until they're older. I paused. I understood it older. Every word was technically true. That is the only kind of lie worth telling, the kind that doesn't require you to remember what you said because you said something real. You simply said the smallest possible real thing, and let the listener build the rest. He was quiet for a moment. The bayou exhaled around us, slow and heavy. Your grandmother, he repeated. The way he said it told me he was filing it away. Not dismissing it. Filing it. There is a difference, and I felt it in my chest like pressure. She's gone, I added, before he could ask. Because she was. That part required no careful management. That part was simply grief, plain and unadorned, and I let it sit in my voice exactly as it was. Something moved through his expression. Brief. Almost imperceptible. But I had spent 4 years watching this family for the small signals beneath the controlled surfaces, and I caught it. It was not sympathy exactly. It was recognition. The way immortal beings sometimes recognize grief. Not because they are immune to it, but because they have had more of it than any living thing should have to hold. He said, I want to offer you a new arrangement. I waited. My father has not spoken to anyone voluntarily in 6 months. He said it simply, without drama, which made it land harder. He has dismissed 4 companions. He has not eaten properly in 3 weeks. Tonight he looked at you, and he did not look away. He paused. I would like you to stay with him. Not as a member of the household staff. As his personal companion. Your time would be his. Your presence consistent. Your arrangement would be double. He paused again, deliberately. And your past would remain your own. Unexamined. The garden was very quiet. I understood what he was offering. I also understood, with the particular clarity that comes from having survived enough negotiations to recognize one, exactly what the offer meant. He knew there was something to examine. He was choosing, for now, not to examine it. For now was doing all the work in that sentence. For now was the entire weight of the offer pressing down on me in the dark. The alternative, which he did not state because he did not need to, was this. I leave the estate unprotected. I move through a city where 2 ancient families have eyes in every shadow. I go back to being Anya Watson alone, which I had learned was not the same as being safe. It was only the same as being invisible, and I had just destroyed my invisibility in front of an entire room of immortals. There was no good choice. There was only the choice that kept me breathing. All right, I said. He nodded once. No satisfaction in it. No triumph. Just the quiet acknowledgement of a man who had expected this answer and taken no particular pleasure in being right. He left the same way he arrived, without ceremony, without the air making room for him. He was simply gone, and the garden was only a garden again. I stood there a while longer. The mist moved across the water. Something called out from deep in the bayou. A bird, or something older than a bird, and went quiet. That night, I lay in the narrow bed in my room at the end of the servant's wing, and I stared at the ceiling in the dark. My mother's bracelet pressed against my wrist. I did not take it off. I should have taken it off weeks ago. It was the most identifiable thing I owned, the most dangerous thing I carried. But every night, I told myself tomorrow, and every tomorrow, I woke up with it still on because there are some things you cannot put down no matter how much you understand the cost of holding them. I thought about Torelli's face in the moment after I spoke. The sharpness that moved through his eyes. The grief I had named aloud in his own language, the grief he had believed was invisible, that I had reached through 4 years of careful silence and touched like something still warm. I thought about what it means to be seen by the wrong person, and what it means to be seen by someone who might not be wrong at all, only impossible. I thought about Virgil Verdetta saying your past would remain your own, the way he said it like he was making a promise and a warning at the same time, like he was holding a door open and letting me decide whether I understood what was on the other side. I asked myself how much longer I could hold this shape. The shape of Anya Watson, careful and invisible and safe. The shape of a woman who had buried everything she was under 4 years of deliberate smallness. I did not answer. I knew better, by now, than to answer questions like that in the dark. In the dark, the honest answers come too easily, and honest answers have a way of becoming decisions before you are ready to make them. I closed my eyes. In the morning, I would go to Lord Torelli. I would knock on his door, and I would say good morning in the language of his grief, and I would see what was left of him that wanted to be reached. That was tomorrow. That was enough. I want to tell you something that took me by surprise, even though it shouldn't have. I fell in love with Torelli Verdetta. Not the way stories want you to fall in love, not with heat or confusion or the particular vertigo of wanting someone you shouldn't. I fell in love with him the way you fall in love with something true. Quietly, incrementally, with the slow, helpless recognition of a woman who has spent too long around things that were performing realness and has finally, unexpectedly, encountered the genuine article. He was cantankerous. He was difficult in the way that only the very old and very intelligent are difficult, not because he lacked patience, but because he had outlived his tolerance for pretense so completely that he had forgotten how to perform it. He said exactly what he thought. He dismissed what bored him without apology. He had opinions about history that were not opinions at all because he had been there, and he would tell you so with a specificity that was either proof or the most elaborate madness I had ever encountered. The first morning I knocked on his door, he did not answer immediately. I waited. I knocked again. From inside, in the Covenant tongue, "If you are another nurse with another tray of things I didn't ask for, go away," I said, through the door in the same language. "I'm not a nurse. And I didn't bring a tray. I brought an argument if you have the energy for one." A long pause. "Then come in." That was how it began. The argument that first morning was about the fall of Carthage. He had been there, not at the very end, he said, with the particular precision of someone correcting a misremembering, but close enough. Close enough to know that what the histories recorded was incomplete in ways that mattered. I pushed back. He pushed harder. His eyes, which had been dim and flat since I arrived, sharpened into something I recognized immediately as aliveness. The specific brightness of a mind that has found something worth engaging with. He ate breakfast without noticing he was eating it. That was the first time in 3 weeks, Petra told me afterward, her voice carefully neutral, her eyes saying everything she wasn't saying. The weeks that followed had a texture I hadn't expected. Warmth. Not the warmth of comfort or safety. I was too aware of what I was hiding to feel safe, but the warmth of genuine human contact after a long cold. We read together in the Covenant tongue, old texts he kept in a locked cabinet that he opened for me without ceremony, as though it had never occurred to him to wonder why I could read them. Or perhaps it had occurred to him and he had decided, in his ancient and cantankerous way, that he did not care about the answer as much as he cared about having someone to read with. He argued with me about everything: geography, philosophy, the particular failures of people he had known personally who had since become historical figures. He was wrong sometimes, and I told him so, and he loved it. I could see it, the way his jaw would tighten before he conceded a point, the way that tightening was actually suppressed delight. He had not been contradicted honestly in a very long time. Everyone who surrounded him either deferred or disappeared. I did neither. One afternoon, deep into a disagreement about the nature of time that I had initiated and was rapidly losing, he looked at me and said, without preamble, "Neshama." Soul. In the Covenant tongue. He said it the way you say the name of something you have been trying to identify for a long time and have finally placed. Not as a compliment, as a recognition. I felt it land somewhere beneath my sternum and stay there. I did not respond. I looked back at the text in my hands and kept reading because some moments are too full to be touched by words, and I think he knew that because he let it go. He simply picked up his own book, and we sat together in the afternoon light, and outside the windows the bayou breathed its slow and ancient breath, and I thought, I am doing something irreversible. I am loving this man. This difficult, brilliant, lonely, impossible man who does not know what I am and has claimed my soul in a language I was told to forget. I knew what it cost. I was old enough to count it. Virgil watched from doorways. I became aware of it gradually. The way his presence registered at the edge of rooms, the way he never entered spaces where Torelli and I were talking but positioned himself just outside them, occasionally, in the way that people who are thinking hard about something position themselves near the thing they're thinking about. He said very little to me directly during those weeks. When he did speak, it was brief, precise, and it landed with a weight entirely disproportionate to the number of words used, which I suspected was entirely intentional. One evening in late November, I was coming out of the library after Torelli had fallen asleep in his chair, which he did increasingly now, in the relaxed, trusting way of a man who had finally decided the world was not going to end while his eyes were closed. Virgil was in the corridor. He did not appear to be waiting. He appeared to be walking past, which I did not believe for a moment.
He stopped when he saw me.
Looked at me for a moment in that full, unhurried way of his. "You know," he said, "you are the most honest liar I have ever met." I looked at him. I thought about deflecting. I thought about the careful, partial truths I had been managing for weeks, the shape of Anya Watson I kept putting back on every morning, the name that fit worse the longer I wore it. "I know," I said. He nodded once, as though I had confirmed something, and walked on. I stood in the corridor for a long moment after he was gone. My mother's bracelet was warm against my wrist. Down the hall, from behind the library doors, I could hear the old lord breathing in his sleep, slow and deep, the breathing of a man who had finally, after months, let his guard down enough to rest. I had done that. I had given him that. And it was the most complicated gift I had ever given anyone because it was built on a foundation that could not hold forever, and I knew it, and I had given it anyway. That is what it means to love something you know might cost you everything. You do it with open eyes. You do it because the alternative, the years of careful nothing, the practiced smallness, the slow suffocation of becoming no one, is its own kind of dying. And you have already died that way once. You know what it feels like. You know you cannot survive it again. I walked back to my room. I did not take off the bracelet. I never took off the bracelet. There is a particular kind of unraveling that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a confrontation or a raised voice or a moment you can point to afterward and say, "There, that was where it broke." It arrives slowly, in small increments. The way a riverbank erodes not from a single flood but from the daily, patient press of water that has nowhere else to go and all the time in the world to get there. Virgil had all the time in the world. I understood this intellectually. I had understood it since the night in the garden, since the moment he said your past would remain your own, and I heard the for now underneath it like a current under still water. I had known he was not finished. I had known he was simply waiting for the right conditions. What I had underestimated was how gentle it would feel. How almost kind. He began with the small things. Offhand questions woven into ordinary conversation, the kind that don't feel like questions at all until you're lying in bed afterward parsing the architecture of them. Where had I grown up? Ohio, I said. A small town. He nodded. Had I traveled much before Baton Rouge?
Some, I said.
Enough to get tired of moving. He nodded again. Did I have family? Not anymore, I said, and that was true, in the way that the truest things are always also the most painful, and I let the pain show because it was real, and because showing it cost me nothing I wasn't already losing. He never pushed. He never repeated a question. He simply filed each answer away, with that centuries-deep patience, and came back later from a different angle and asked something adjacent. And the adjacent questions were where the gaps were. The places where Anya Watson's history had been constructed rather than lived, where the seams showed if you pressed at exactly the right point with exactly the right pressure. I deflected. I was good at it. I redirected. Answered questions with questions, not clumsily, but in the way of someone who has spent years being genuinely private, which is different from evasive and close enough to pass for a long time. But time was the one resource I was running out of, and he had centuries of it left. It was a Tuesday in December when everything shifted. I was in the East Corridor, returning a book to the library, when I heard voices from the direction of the main hall, low and urgent, the specific register of men communicating something serious without letting it become loud. I slowed. I did not stop. I kept walking at the same measured pace, the same unremarkable footfall, and I heard Virgil's voice, controlled and cold in a way I hadn't heard it before, saying something to Farrell about the perimeter. Then I heard him say, "Praxii Scout. Caught near the southern gate an hour ago." My body reacted before my mind did. That is the thing no one tells you about survival, that after long enough, the fear lives below thought. It doesn't wait for you to process. It moves through your face, your hands, the particular quality of your stillness, before you have consciously registered the danger. I kept walking. 3 more steps.
4.
I turned the corner into the library corridor and stopped, pressing my back to the wall, and I breathed. Slowly.
Carefully.
The way you breathe when you need your body to believe the emergency is over even though everything in you knows it isn't. When I came out of the library 20 minutes later, Virgil was in the corridor. He was not waiting. He appeared to simply be there, in the way he appeared to simply be places. He looked at me, and I looked at him, and I watched him read something in my face that I had not been fast enough to clear. He did not say, "You reacted." He did not say, "I saw you." He did not say anything for a long moment, and that silence was the most precise instrument he had used on me yet. Then, carefully, so carefully that the gentleness of it was almost unbearable, he asked, "Is there anything you want to tell me?" Not, "What are you hiding?" Not, "Who are you really?" Just that. An open door. An offered hand. The kind of question that only works as a trap if you decide to walk into it, and only works as a mercy if you decide to take it. I could not answer it honestly. I could not answer it dishonestly without him hearing the lie. I had run out of the middle ground I had been living in for months, and I stood there in that corridor, and I felt the walls of it close in from every side simultaneously, and I understood, with a total clarity that only comes when all your options are finally genuinely gone, that I had been here before. Not in this corridor. Not with this man. But in this moment, the moment where survival and truth are no longer compatible and you have to choose right now which one you can live with losing. I kissed him. I want to be clear about what that was. It was not strategy. It was not calculated or constructed or designed to redirect his attention, though I understand why it might look that way from the outside. I am 38 years old. I have lived long enough to know the difference between a woman using desire as a weapon and a woman simply running out of walls to put between herself and something she has been refusing to feel for months. I kissed him because I was tired. Because he was standing there asking me with such devastating gentleness if I wanted to tell him the truth, and the truth was so large and so dangerous and so tangled up in everything I stood to lose that I could not speak it, but I could not keep not speaking it either. And in the space between those two impossibilities, my body made a decision my mind was still too frightened to make. His hands came to my face. Carefully. The way you hold something you have been afraid of dropping for a very long time. He kissed me back. And then he pulled back just enough to look at me. His eyes were dark and very steady, and what was in them was not triumph, not hunger. It was the same patience I had been watching for months, but stripped now of its distance. Up close it looked different. Up close it looked like waiting. Like a man who had known something was coming and had decided, a long time ago, that he would not rush it. He knew. I could see that he knew. He had known for longer than I was comfortable calculating, and he had not forced it. He had waited for me to be ready to fall. He needed me to say it myself. And I was almost ready. Almost. If this story is finding you at the right time, if something in it is pressing on something real, don't let it slip away.
Subscribe.
There are more of these. More women, more nights, more moments of impossible choice. They're here, and they're waiting, and they don't always come back if you let them go. I dressed carefully that morning. Not for beauty. For armor. There is a difference, and every woman who has ever walked into a room that could destroy her knows exactly what I mean. You choose what you wear the way a soldier checks their equipment. Not vanity, not performance, but the quiet act of deciding what version of yourself you are willing to let them see. I put on the dark dress Virgil had left outside my door without explanation the night before. I braided my hair back. I left my face bare because there was nothing left to hide behind, and I had decided, somewhere in the sleepless hours before dawn, that I was finished with hiding. I almost took off the bracelet. My hand closed around it. Copper and elder iron, warm from my skin the way it was always warm, the way it had been warm since my mother pressed it onto my wrist the last time I saw her alive and said, in the Covenant tongue, "Carry this for me. Carry it until you don't need to anymore." I left it on. The chamber beneath the Mississippi levee was everything ancient power looks like when it stops pretending to be anything else. Stone walls the color of old bone. black water audible through the foundations, a low, continuous pressure, like the river itself leaning in to listen. Torches rather than electricity, because the families gathered in this room were old enough to find electricity a passing novelty. Every elder of both dynasties present, arranged on opposite sides of a long stone table, the space between them dense with centuries of accumulated grievance. I entered on Virgil's arm, not behind him, beside him, which was itself a statement, and I felt the room receive it, a ripple of attention moving through both sides of the table simultaneously, the way wind moves through two separate fields of grass. I kept my eyes level. I did not search the room. I let the room come to me. My father I registered in my peripheral vision before I let myself look directly at him. Lord Kalen Praxii, seated at the far end of the opposing table, was older than I remembered, or perhaps not older, perhaps simply more fully himself, without the softening filter of a daughter's love. He was looking at Virgil. He looked at me the way he looked at all of Virgil's accompaniments, briefly, assessingly, then away.
He did not know me.
For years and grief and deliberate transformation had done their work. I was not the girl who had run from his house in the dark. I was someone else entirely. For approximately 40 seconds, I believed I was going to survive this. Then I felt it. Not a sound. A stillness. A specific, surgical stillness on the left side of the room that moved against the grain of everything else, because everything else was shifting, murmuring, the low political weather of two dynasties negotiating proximity, and this one stillness was moving in the opposite direction. Drawing inward.
Concentrating.
I turned because I had to. Because the body knows before the mind admits it. My brother Sorrel was not looking at my face. He was looking at my wrist. He had not seen me in 4 years. He would not have recognized my face. I had made certain of that, in all the ways available to a woman determined to disappear. But he had grown up in the same house I had grown up in. He had sat beside me at our mother's funeral. He had watched them place that bracelet on my wrist, copper and elder iron, unmistakable in its pattern, unique in all the world because our mother had made it herself in the old way, and there was not another one in existence. His eyes moved from the bracelet to my face. The recognition did not arrive loudly. That was the worst part. It arrived in his stillness, in the way his entire body stopped, the way his breath ceased mid-exhale, the way his hands flattened on the table in front of him as though he needed something solid to hold on to. Then very quietly, so quietly that it should not have carried, and yet it did, in the acoustics of that ancient stone room it carried perfectly, he said my name. My real name.
Dahlia.
What happened next happened very fast, and I remember it in fragments the way you remember the moments immediately following an impact. Both sides of the table fracturing into movement.
Chairs back.
Old violence surfacing in ancient faces like something that had been waiting below the skin for centuries and was finally being given permission. My father's head snapping toward me, the recognition arriving in him seconds after Sorrel spoke it, and something moving through his face that I cannot fully name, rage and grief, and the particular expression of a man who has found something he had written off as lost and does not yet know whether to claim it or punish it. Virgil stepped in front of me, not reaching for me, not pulling me back, simply placing himself between me and the room, which is a different gesture entirely. He was not shielding me from consequence. He was refusing the consequence, refusing to allow this room to do what rooms like this do to the things standing in the center of them. I looked at his back, at the set of his shoulders, and I thought he knew. He is known, and he is still here, and he is standing in front of a room full of ancient violence for a woman whose real name he is only now hearing aloud. I thought, I am not going to hide behind him. Then the room changed, not because of Virgil. Not because of me, because from the Verdetta side of the table, something moved. Slowly, with the sound of a chair and the deliberate placement of weight, and then Lord Torelli Verdetta was on his feet. Without his cane. The room went quiet the way rooms go quiet for things that do not happen. Torelli had not stood without his cane in months. Torelli had not addressed a room like this in longer than most of the people in it could personally remember. He stood at his full height, diminished by age, yes, but radiating something that age had not touched, something that centuries of survival had compressed into a density that filled the room without requiring volume. He spoke in the Covenant tongue. He said, "This woman sat with me in the dark when I had forgotten how to want morning. She argued with me about Carthage. She made coffee the way my wife used to make it, and she did not pity me, and she did not fear me. And she read to me in the language of the Covenant until I remembered why I had chosen to keep living through all the centuries that tried to take that choice from me." He paused. "She carries both bloods. She always has. Perhaps that is not a betrayal. Perhaps that is precisely what two families who have only ever spoken to each other in blood have needed for longer than either of them will admit." The room did not become peaceful.
I want to be honest about that.
Peace was not what fell over that chamber. What fell was something older than peace. It was the silence of things that have been running for a very long time and have suddenly, without warning, run out of room to keep going. Into that silence, I stepped forward. Not behind Virgil. Beside him. And then one step further in front. I looked at my father. I looked at my brother, Sorrel, whose stillness had broken into something that looked, if I let myself see it, like a man trying very hard not to come apart in a room full of his enemies. I looked at the Verdetta elders. I looked at the stone walls and the torchlight and the black water pressing through the foundations, the river that had been here before any of us and would be here long after.
And I spoke.
In the Covenant tongue, the language of both families, the language of the original accord before the war, before the fracture, before two bloodlines decided that what they shared was less important than what divided them. I did not make a speech. I did not argue or plead or negotiate. I simply spoke the words of the Covenant as they were originally written, in the accent of the old interior, in the voice of a woman who had spent 4 years being silent and was finished. I said, "We were one agreement before we were two families. We can be one agreement again. I am the proof that it is possible. I am still here." That was December. It is now late spring. The Bayou estate in the morning has a quality of light I have come to love without deciding to. The way the sun comes through the live oak sideways, the way the mist is almost gone by 9 but leaves the air feeling washed and quiet and briefly newly made. Torelli sits in the garden with a book he pretends to read and mostly uses as a prop while he watches the birds argue over the fountain. He looks, on mornings like this, like a man who has made his peace with being alive. I do not take that lightly. I know what it costs to get him here. Virgil brings me coffee without asking how I take it. He has known for months. He sets it beside me and sits down and does not fill the silence with anything unnecessary, which remains one of the things I love most about him, that he understands the value of quiet between people who have already said the hardest things. I am Dahlia, Verdetta Praxii. Not a symbol. Not a bridge constructed for others to cross and discard. A woman who stopped disappearing and discovered, to her own complicated and overwhelming relief, that what was underneath the disappearing was more than enough. More than she had remembered. More than she had dared to claim. This morning I looked down at my wrist, at the bracelet, copper and elder iron, warm from my skin. I whispered one word in the Covenant tongue. The word that means, I am still here. I meant it. For the first time in 4 years, I meant it without grief underneath it. Without the exhaustion of survival dressed up as living. I meant it the way you mean something when you have finally, after everything, earned the right to say it plainly. I am still here. And I am home. There are women like Dahlia in every story I carry, women who survived by disappearing and found their way back to themselves through the most unexpected door. If this one found you tonight, if something in it moved something quiet and old and real inside you, subscribe so the next one can find you too. These stories exist. And they don't always come back if you let them go.